Hi, and welcome to Wyrd Wessex. My name's Andy.
And I'm Craig.
So what are we talking about today, Craig?
Well, today we're delighted to welcome the author Nicholas Jubber to the podcast. He's an award-winning travel writer and author of the book Monsterland, A Journey Around the World's Dark Imagination. Nick's work is a fascinating blend of travelogue, cultural history and psychological exploration as he journeys to the places where monsters' tales are not just told but lived. So join us as we delve into the dark and wild places of the world to discover what these creatures can truly tell us about ourselves. So yeah, welcome to the show, Nick.
Oh, thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.
Very welcome. I guess other than my brief kind of introduction there, it might be a good place to start is maybe for anyone in the audience that's not familiar with you and your work. Do you want to give us like your elevator pitch? Like tell us what you do in a nutshell.
Oh my gosh, right. That's putting me on the spot, isn't it? Yeah.
Justify yourself.
Yeah. Who am I? What am I doing here? I write books which have taken me to all kinds of places. The first one I wrote took me on a sort of quest around the Middle East, the Near East, Middle East, and into East Africa on a journey following a medieval physician who was sent in the year 1177 to send a letter to Prester John, the mythical priest king of the Indies. And I guess since then I've been doing various different sort of missions and quests and adventures, traveling to different places around the world, exploring stories really and myths and that sort of crossover between history and folklore and legend, and looking at where humans in all kinds of different cultures kind of connect and where those stories join us together, and also how different and sort of magnificently sort of wonderfully diverse they are in all sorts of different places. And it's taken me on a journey through Iran and Afghanistan in the footsteps of a medieval poet, Ferdowsi, who wrote the amazing Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, which has stories of snakes bursting out of a tyrant's shoulders and eating the brains of the youth, and dragon slaying heroes and all kinds of wonderful adventures. It's taken me on a journey around stories behind fairy tales, most recently in a book called The Fairy Tellers, where I delved into the lives of some of the forgotten figures in the history of fairy tales, like Giambattista Basile, who produced Europe's first sort of great fairy tale collection, or Dorchenville, who told stories to the Brothers Grimm, or Gabrielle Susan de Villeneuve, who told the first published version of Beauty and the Beast. And most recently, in this new book, which is out this year, Monsterland, it's taken me on a journey across, probably my biggest journey yet, really, across a dozen countries and 4 continents, exploring monsters and what are they all about, and why are we perennially fascinated by them, but also how we have our ideas and attitudes towards monsters evolved and shifted over the ages.
Fantastic. And I mean, obviously, having read the book, sort of, I know a little bit more about this one than someone that hasn't. But could you tell us when or where your interest in monsters sort of truly first began?
Well, it's something that goes right the way back. I mean, I was one of those kids who was always fascinated by monsters, and in a way, kind of, I think I was sort of monster positive from early.
I like that.
And sort of one of the phrases I use in a few of my talks really is this idea of being monster positive. I think I was always fascinated by them, but I was also fascinated by the idea of what it might be like to become one. They weren't the sort of repellent, terrifying things. I mean, there were obviously monsters that did terrify me and gave me nightmares, but I think the ones that really intrigued me were the ones where you might turn into them and become them. And in fact, when I was 8.5, I came back from the woods near where I grew up in Hertfordshire, and I'd been stung by something on a log, and the skin on my leg was changing color. There were blisters appearing, and I got very excited. I thought, I was going to develop sucker pads or maybe tentacles, bristles down my back. Who knew what might happen? And then eventually I was taken to the GP and given a prescription for antihistamine and told I'd been bitten by an adder, which was quite disappointing, really. Much more exciting was going to happen. So I think there was that sort of feeling of kind of wanting to know what it might be like to be a monster that sort of has been there all the way through. When I got married, my wife and I, by mutual consent, I should add, decided to name the wedding, the tables at our wedding after different monsters. You know, people have names for their you know the tables at the wedding, but we thought monsters would be a good theme, so which we thought was great until we sat down to work out the table plan and had to decide where we were going to put our in-laws, whether with the ogres or the trolls or the Daleks or whatever. So it was you know, we had a lot of fun actually doing that. So yeah, so it's been a theme sort of throughout my life, and in the books that I've explored, there's often been supernatural creatures or monsters there in the corners of them somewhere. The first book about the kingdom of Prester John, where he had, you know, all kinds of myths sort of packed into his kingdom, and people believed that was where you'd go out to find the Kuna Kethalai, the sort of dog-headed creatures, or the Blemmies who had their heads in their chests, and all these different sort of strange beings that people believe populated the world. Or with the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings that took me across Afghanistan and Iran in the footsteps of a medieval poet. You've got amazing creatures there from Persian myth, like the Divs, who are sort of spotted creatures with great curling horns that come out from their mountain fastnesses to prey on the knights and paladins who are the sort of heroes of those tales. So the monsters were always there, and I was always really intrigued by those stories involving the monsters, and sort of wondering who were the monsters, where do they come from, because they're often reflections of some kind of other, the outcasts of society, or the tribe across the valley, or, you know, the neighbors that are disliked. And you see that through monster history. You see it all the way through to today. I mean, you could take any of our really volatile political situations going on in the world right now, and the chances are, and I think I've seen it, I mean, just something I was reading in Rhetoric today from one of the things going on in the Middle East, where people will dismiss others as monsters, and they will, you know, that's how people take the humanity away from each other. So there's those kind of depths, and I think as I was delving into the subject, I was fascinated both by the sort of surface of all these amazing, different, wonderfully varied monsters that you get in all kinds of stories, both within specific cultures and across cultures around the world, but also when you delve into some of those sort of psychological depths that can be very disturbing in some ways and also very enlightening.
Oh, fantastic. I mean, yeah, it's you know, and you see it in the conflict in Ukraine as well, don't you? Sort of they refer to like the other side as orcs and things like that as well.
Yeah, exactly. People have been doing it forever. You know, it's the easiest way to fight war, really. If you turn your enemy into monsters, then, you know, your soldiers will have no compunction about shooting them dead. But that's there through, you know, through human history. And that's the thing about monsters, that they are there with us. They're our mirror. You know, we've been, as long as there's been human civilization, there has been monsters. So, you know, if you go back to the very first known sort of work of literature, the first sort of epic story, Gilgamesh, from the Sumerian culture, you've got the monster Humbaba, the terrible. You've got, obviously, in the Greek epics, in the Odyssey, the Cyclops, and many different types of monsters, the Lastrygonians and the Sirens and so forth. You've got in the Indian epics, the Ramayana, wonderful, the Rakshasas, these sort of wonderful demonic beings that guard the kidnapped Princess Sita and have to be tackled with a bridge made out of monkeys. And so you have all these different monsters right the way back, sort of in these stories told thousands of years ago. And it's one of the amazing things, actually, that when we look at some of the real classic, so many of the classic monsters, their histories go back very, very long time. You know, people have been telling stories of dragons for thousands of years. It's, you know, quite hard actually for the modern monster makers to sort of compete with them, because those ancient monsters are so deeply rooted in us. But they're there right the way through our history, and so we can track sort of patterns in human history, I think, through these different attitudes to monsters, the different kind of monsters that stories were told about. And so in my book, I'm looking at that, sort of looking at them through that lens of seeing them as that mirror to history, so that we start with monsters as being these sort of godlike beings that people worshipped as the sort of the ultimate kind of expression of imaginative terror, you know, what might be bringing down floods and droughts and or tearing the babies out of mothers' wombs, you know, the fear of these terrifying super beings up there. And then gradually, as human society became more and more confident, we pulled these monsters down, and they became the sort of the target for heroes to show their valor, to slay the dragon. That's the classic sort of monster trope, the dragon slayer who then claims the territory. And we have that in so many different cultures around the world. I mean, in Britain, one of our sort of founding myths is the idea that we had to defeat lots of giants, that the island of Albion was populated by giants, and the heroes who were sort of descended from the ancient Trojans had come there and decided to settle this misty, rain-sodden island. So they tackled all these giants until they got all the way to Cornwall and had to fight off the greatest of the giants, Gog Magog, who broke the warrior Corineus's ribs, and that so annoyed him and aggravated his temper that he lifted up the giant. So he must have been pretty strong, and hurled him off Plymouth Pier. So that's the sort of the spot really where where Britain really sort of came into its own, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain. So a lot of these ancient stories, they're foundational myths, and they're a way for sort of human society to sort of look at ourselves and pump ourselves up a bit and say, hey, we defeated these monsters and now we've claimed the territory. And then you move on through history, and you have this sort of fascination growing, especially in medieval stories, of the idea of the monster within us. And so you get a lot of these stories of shapeshifters, stories of werewolves, and the jinn in Islamic culture, and all kinds of lots of different kinds of shapeshifters. And then gradually, as we move into the sort of more sort of what we think of as the scientific age, and we sort of pushed aside the monsters of the wild, we've sort of tamed, or believe that we've tamed the wild, and increasingly the frontier to confront then is the frontier of death itself. And so gradually, as we move into that sort of Gothic era, you get these monsters of the undead, the ghosts and the zombies, and most glamorously of all, of course, the vampires. And then as we go a little bit further through history, we have that huge change that happens in the 19th century with industrialization happening and increasing sort of technological advancements, and that fear and anxiety about what science will do. And that's encapsulated in that most brilliant of monster novels, Frankenstein, where the young Mary Shelley came up with this sort of amazing image for that anxiety, but also that sort of passion for technological progress, but married to that fear of what happens if it gets out of control and then consumes us. And that's an idea that I think has sort of been hinged to monster stories ever since. That idea that it's we, the humans, who are really creating the most terrifying of the monsters, the mad scientist trope. That we're sort of unshackled in our ambition and our greed and that that nothing can compete with us really for the damage that we can wreak. But that's that narrative it always carries on. It always evolves in different ways, and in fact now I think as a monster positive it's very exciting actually to see in a way the curve that's been happening in recent years, recent decades. I think these are all sort of slow patterns of a sort of narrative evolution, where you see the monsters increasingly being foregrounded and being the sort of at the center of the stories, whether in that sort of postmodern Shrek way, or in things like the Avatar movie series, where it's the big tall blue guys with the pointy ears and the tails who are now the heroes, and the alpha males with the big muscles and the guns, they're very much the villains. So that's a pretty exciting development as well. So who knows where that's going to go off in the future.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of got that with the continuation of guess what Mary Shelley started in a way with things like Jurassic Park or Godzilla, things like that. Monsters of our own creation.
Yeah, I mean, Godzilla is an amazing one, isn't it? Because it's such a perfect balance, I think, between the idea of an ancient creature that's come out of the sea, and in the original Godzilla movie, which is, I think, an absolutely beautiful classic work of 1950s monster movie making. You have this scene where they're trying to pacify the creature by putting on Tengu goblin masks and reciting sort of Shinto scriptures, and trying to sort of ward the creature off and get it to go back into the sea, following sort of ancient traditions of exorcism. But this is a monster that has been sort of supercharged by atomic power. So it's got this perfect combination of the ancient and what was then the very modern. And you think of in 1954, for Japanese audiences, they were living absolutely not only in the wake of the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also the continued experimentation on atomic power that was going on with the explosion of bombs at Bikini Atoll, that the very year that Godzilla was made. And I think that was one of the key sort of inspirations for making the film. So it's a film that came very much out of a particular political moment and the fear and anxiety that was going through Japanese society at that time, but that also drew on Japanese culture and is a sort of celebration of that culture. And I think that's part of where its power comes from, that combination of that anxiety and that sort of that pride in that storytelling culture. And a lot of monsters, I think that is something that they're able to plug into. They both tap into terror and fear, but also into something that's celebratory. You know, we look at monsters and we're excited, and we want to go and see them. You know, there's nothing better for sort of drawing, you know, if you want to get a big crowd in a public place, get somebody dressed up as a monster and people will come. So it's always this sort of, I think, it's an intriguing combination of factors.
I think as well, I mean, that's almost the same with horror films though, isn't it? Like it's almost like a safe danger, which is where the kind of excitement comes from it.
Exactly.
Same with roller coasters, that kind of thing.
Yes, right? Exactly. Why do we go on roller coasters when we're going to get thrown upside down? And yet we do.
I don't.
Yes, exactly. I know. I was on one not so long ago with my 9-year-old and wondering what on earth was I doing here. But you know, there is something really. I think these are primal things. You know, this is why people were telling these stories. You know, thousands of years ago. If you read, I don't know, like a story like Beowulf, you think that people were telling this around the Half Place in 10th century Anglo-Saxon England, and it's a story that at its heart is about monsters and terrifying monsters, and they're described in beautifully lurid, poetic language with really real relish for the violence that they wreak. But people must have been sitting there, you know, around the Half Place relishing the tale. You know, that's why these tales, you know, were carried on being told and getting written down. So it's something that is innate in us, and I think, you know, that's I think it's one of the things I find exciting about the idea of monsters is the thought, especially with these ancient monsters, is the thought that, you know, that I could sit there like reading, say, the passages about the destruction of Grendel as he comes into the mead hall in Beowulf, and I know that somebody 1,000 years ago reacted probably in quite a similar way, and that feeling that you're connected to those audiences from long ago. It's a way that we connect with people across many different generations, and also, you know, across different cultures as well.
Yeah, interesting idea as well. Like, because I've seen someone retell Beowulf in a mead hall, so I've had that little bit closer relationship to the story.
There's something special about it, isn't there?
Yeah.
I do want to get back onto the questions I've written down, but I do want to just quickly ask: did you ever work out what it was that stung or bit you in Hertfordshire? Was it an adder or was it an insect?
It was an adder.
It was. I thought it was an adder. Yeah.
Or at least that was what the prescription was. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's sort of alluded to it in the book, but I was like, oof.
Yeah.
You know, oof.
Yeah.
Because I think it says adder. It says adder in the book.
It does say an adder. Yeah. I read that bit a while ago.
That's all right. Yeah. But, you know, maybe they were just covering it up. Who knows?
This is true.
Who knows what really lurks in those woods, especially
exactly all those weird types that come from Hertfordshire.
Yes.
So I was just wondering as well, because obviously, you know, sort of being a travel writer, having traveled, you know, being so far travelled, I don't suppose it's that unusual for you, but you go from like Cornwall to Japan, from the Middle East, Mexico. It's quite a journey you undertook for this book. So what inspired you to, I guess, not only sort of undertake this, but also go to those far-flung locations?
Yes, it was quite an odyssey for this one, and a lot of different places to go to. So it was quite an undertaking. But it's curiosity, really, that I felt like if I'm going to delve into what monsters mean around the world, I have to travel around the world. I have to meet people sort of on the ground in different places. You know, I could have contacted experts and talked to them on Zoom and had lots of sort of efficiently run dialogues with people on various subjects about monsterology. But I felt like that wouldn't really be getting to the heart of the subject, which for me was about working out how communities gather around monsters. And for that, I needed to go out to these places. So, for example, going to Mexico, I wanted to go out to during the time of Day of the Dead and talk to people on the streets of Mexico about what that means, what the ghosts mean to them, the stories about the ghosts. And it was through that I was invited into people's homes and was able to sort of sit around the ofrenda table when people gather the sort of the favorite food and drinks of people who have passed and remember them. And these were really moving moments for me, but they were also moments where people start telling stories. They are classic sitting around the hearth place moments. So people then started telling the stories of their encounters with ghosts, and I heard some really creepy ones. And there was a guy in a town called Tepoztlan who invited me into his home. I was with some people who had lived in this town, and so it was really they were able to sort of translate for me and introduce me. So there was some wonderful serendipities that happen when you travel. And so I heard this guy telling his story of how he had encountered the ghost La Llorona, which means the weeping woman, who's this sort of very creepy ghost that recurs again and again throughout Mexican culture, and is especially associated with places to do with water. And his story was that when he was younger, he'd been heavily drinking, a bit of a delinquent, and then one night he'd seen this ghost, and she'd come towards him, sort of hovering a few inches off the ground, her arms bent forward, long hair under a rebozo shawl, a beautiful face that then suddenly turns into a sort of grimacing skull. And he'd obviously run as fast as he possibly could, ran all the way back home until he leaped into his parents' bed. And his mother said to him, "You're 25 years old, you can sleep in your own bed." And then he said, "I've just seen the ghost of your owner." So she said, "Oh, okay, fair enough." But he never touched a drop of alcohol after that, or not for a while, I think. Anyway, also needed needed quite a lot of help, I think, to recover from that experience. But he told it with
wouldn't you?
Yeah,
sort of openness.
clean pants.
And that's, you hear people's stories when you travel. I'm not going to hear those kind of stories connecting with an expert on Zoom. You have to go to places, and then there's the luck, the sort of the weird things that go on in journeys. Sometimes a day will pass and you think, "Oh God, I don't know why I'm here. I haven't really seen anything or met anybody." And then the next day, suddenly, you'll meet a whole bunch of different people with all kinds of really interesting stories. And as it's the wonder of travel. It's a bug that I've never quite managed to shake off, because I think it brings you to those kind of insights that you just can't get any other way.
Yeah, we recently had a little road trip of our own, didn't we, Andy?
We did. Not quite as far flung. That was quite.
Well, we got as far as the distant lands of Cornwall. I mean,
oh my God, there's nowhere further, is there? Giant country.
No. Yes, and same kind of thing, really. We had a plan, but there's stuff that happens on the journey that you're not expecting, and places you end up going.
Exactly, and I think with travel, I think that it's with a lot of my journeys. I think it's sort of having that balance between kind of knowing sort of what you're on the lookout for, but then kind of let things happen, because you might just go off in a different direction and find something. I mean, for example, that town Tepoztlan, I hadn't planned to go there when I went out to Mexico, but I got in touch with somebody who was a film archivist and who'd in fact restored Mexico's first horror movie, and who then invited me for lunch there. And then I was going to go back to Mexico City, but she said, "Oh no, you should stay. There's quite a few interesting people to meet." And then that led through meeting one person after another, to eventually some of these ghost stories that I heard. So I think it's the what I find so fun and exciting about travel, that you never quite know who you're going to meet, what stories they're going to tell you, and it's what you're going to learn.
And it's just seeing these wonderful things. Like I just got back from Spain a few weeks ago, and there was a festival in this town called Sabadell, just sort of about half an hour, 40 minutes north of Barcelona, and they had all, sort of in the day, it was the usual sort of, older sort of things, like, sort of giant figures in traditional dress walking around. But then in the evening, it's like there's a big toad with a witch riding it, shooting fireworks into the crowd, and people are just dancing in these. And they had this like tall figure with a goat's head and breasts. And occasionally it would bend down so they could reset the fireworks on its horns. But once it did. And I just saw everyone run over. And my partner is from that region, but she hasn't lived there for ages. I don't know why they're doing it. So I just legged it over as well. and the breasts were fixed to essentially lactate wine, and so it's just part of the tradition. You go and drink wine from the breasts of the, and it's just I was like, I need to come back and find out more about this.
Oh
So,
wow! So people were going over to drink the wine.
yeah, just in the crowd,
Making
just
use.
literally rushing over, and yeah.
That's right. Wow. Oh, there you go.
Um,
Wow, yes, that sounds fun. So, yeah, I mean that's the thing. There are a lot of monsters. A lot of the monsters that I sort of travelled around in this for this book are connected with festivals. So you've got obviously Day of the Dead being the most famous one in Mexico, but there's an amazing one in Germany and Bavaria, in a place called Fürstenwald, where a town that calls itself the Dragonstadt, the sort of town of the dragon, because they have this tradition of a dragon parade that goes back for hundreds of years, and goes back to, I think it was first recorded in 1590, and they've been sort of parading this dragon pretty much every year ever since, except for a brief hiatus during World War II and another during COVID. And at the moment, the dragon is now this huge high-tech construction made for millions of euros by various special effects companies, including, I think, Magicon, who did the special effects for the Harry Potter movies. And it's the world's largest walking robot, and people dressed in medieval and ancient garb, they parade alongside it, and eventually two people are chosen as the knight and the lady, and the lady sort of welcomes the refugees and the fugitives from the dragon into the castle, and the knight gets to spear the dragon in that sort of vulnerable spot in its throat and slay it. And that's a tradition that, that as I mentioned, has been going on for centuries. So those kind of festivals, those gatherings were really fascinating to me, because you do get to meet a lot of people and you see what these monsters mean to them. And there, they were people have, it's the continuity of it. I think in that particular instance, a lot of the people that I met there, they would talk about how their grandparents, their great grandparents had been involved in the parade. Their children were getting involved, their grandchildren. So it was that sense that they're all joined together through this story of a dragon. And of course, everybody loves the dragon. They slay the dragon. The dragon has to be defeated. They even have their phrase that Fürstenwald can only live if the dragon dies. But in fact, it's really the opposite way around. Actually, Fürstenwald does very, very well out of the dragon. Economically, it's a huge factor. And there was a period in the 19th century where the religious authorities were trying to ban the dragon parade, because they thought it was all, had this sort of pagan overtones. But the people rallied and defended the parade and kicked off, really had quite a riot against the pastorage, saying, we're going to keep up our dragon parade because they were economically dependent on it. It brought in such crowds, it brought in revenue, but also because they love their dragon and they have a huge sort of emotional connection to it. So it's one of those sort of strange, wonderful occasions where you see all these different meanings that the monsters have. That there is on the surface this sort of straightforward dragon slaying story, probably one of the most repeated sort of monster stories that there is around the world. But underneath that, there's this way of joining people together across generations, a way that people bond and come together, and but also a dark side to it, because of course when people bond and come together as a community, they will sometimes turn against other communities, or they'll see the dragon then as representing something else, something other. And so in this case, the dragon had been during the Cold War, it was seen as sort of the beast from the east, representing the sort of the people across the Iron Curtain. And during World War II, obviously there were all sorts of sort of resonances that people would bring about the dragon into their rhetoric, inspired by Nazi ideology, and so there's all these sort of different sort of dark ways in which these monster stories have been used. So it's there's lots of different things going on there, and that's again something that I think these sort of traveling into these stories has sort of always helps me to understand, to try and sort of pick sort of unpack all these different things that are happening with these stories, because they're all so multi-layered, and so you really need to sort of be able to talk to people on the ground to find out sort of, well, what does that story mean to you, what does it mean to you now, what has it meant to people before, and where do you see the story going?
Yeah, so in your introduction to the book, you told us about your desire to become a monster.
Yes.
So I wondered whether there was a monster that you covered that you have a particular affinity towards.
Well, I I'm very yes. I mean, I'm often when people ask me like, "What's your favorite monster?" My go-to is often the dragon because I love the sort of the splendor, the visual splendor of a dragon, and certainly being
Yeah.
able to sort of experience the dragon parade in Firth and Val was one of my favorite experiences of the journeys. To sort of be right up close with this huge dragon with his massive wingspan, and it breathes out fire and roars and so on. But I think, as far as sort of the idea of that sort of fascination for becoming a monster, I think there's a lot of the sort of shape-shifting stories have fascinated me, and I had a lot. I got a lot out of delving into the stories of werewolves. In the book, I go into the werewolf of Louisiana, the Rougarou, which is usually depicted as a werewolf, but can be presented as a different kind of animal. But I think it certainly sort of fits into that sort of werewolf paradigm. And it was really interesting actually talking to people about the different ways in which sort of the different meanings that story has for them. The classic story of the Rougarou is it operates a bit like a werewolf, except it's vulnerable. If you cut it and make it bleed, then the curse is broken and it turns back into human form. And you can't, if you know that somebody's become a Rougarou, if you've released them from the curse, you can't tell anybody for a year and a day. So the classic story has the guy who knows this secret and has to keep it inside his head for a year and a day, and he can't quite do it, as people in stories usually end up just not quite being able to hold on to that secret, and then ends up sort of getting blighted by the curse and becoming a Rougarou himself, howling into the bayous. So that was that I think the idea of becoming a werewolf is quite intriguing to me, also because it's temporary. So you could be a werewolf at night, and then you can go back to your normal sort of have your normal daytime. So obviously it depends on how much chaos you have wreaked at night, and how much tidying up there is to do, I suppose. But there's always the hope that you might be able to control it. But then that's what people always hope, isn't it? That they'll control the monster within. That's the sort of Jekyll and Hyde issue. Nobody's ever quite able to do it. So whilst I am monster positive and do quite love, I sort of like the idea of like what would it be like to become a monster, I think also if I was actually given the choice, I would probably back off because I think you're asking for too much trouble already.
Mm.
So it's evident from sort of what we've spoken about now and the book that sort of monsters within folklore, just as often as they are a metaphor for our fears at the time, like the dark places, the forces of nature, and the fears of what we can create, but they're also, as you say, a sort of that reflection of the dark places within ourselves. And yeah, I think it comes across in Monsterland very well. That some of these monsters are sort of sympathetic creatures. I mean, I kind of weirdly feel a bit of sympathy for Bolster myself,
Yeah.
poor guy, just unlucky in love. But I mean, there was an article in the the Sun a few years back about what was it? I've got it here. Snowflake students think Frankenstein's monster is misunderstood and is in fact a victim. Obviously, they, sort of kind of missed the point of the book, really, if they thought that was ludicrous. But
Yeah.
do you think people often lose sight of the human side of these monsters? Like you've said, I mean, you just mentioned how they are used as an othering. But
Yeah.
do you think it's something that we are sort of we need to get back to almost a little bit? Is seeing like finding the sympathy for them as well,
I think
and
there
sort of the
are.
reflection they encourage us to do as well.
Yeah, I think Frankenstein's monster is an interesting one because I think that almost everybody that I've spoken to about Frankenstein seems to feel sympathy for the monster, much more so than they feel for the scientist.
Unless you're the son.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the son is there. Yeah, it probably reflects maybe the kind of people who I've been talking to about Frankenstein. I should probably talk to a Sun editor on their view on it. But the I think there is a growing sense of amongst people who are interested in monster stories and are interested in those kind of narratives, I think a sense that that's where the real sort of pith of things is, that's the really interesting stuff, that the heroes are of less interest to us at the moment than the monsters. And it's through the stories of the monsters and through sort of a kind of revisionist way of looking at what's it like from the monster's point of view. And this is something that's been going on for quite a while. And there's a book about Grendel by the writer John Gardner, which was published decades ago, which was looking at sort of Beowulf through the perspective of the monster. Obviously, with Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein, she was, she doesn't call him the monster; he's the creature, and he is referred to by others though as ogre, fiend, demon, and all kinds of things. She has she gives him several chapters worth of incredibly eloquent self-expression in the middle of the novel, which I think is a sort of template for getting yourself inside the head of the monster, where he tells us what his life has been like since being rejected by his father, by his creator, by Victor Frankenstein. And I think it's the big error of Victor the scientist, that he rejects the creature that he has created, and then rejects him again when he pleads to have some kind of partner, or to have some way out of the solitude and the loneliness that he's been afflicted with. So it's really, I think it's really interesting, this question of like, do we side with the monster, or do we side with the heroes, the monster slayers? And I find personally it's quite hard to side with the monster slayers these days, because I usually find them really annoying. The sort of that kind of alpha male hero figure just feels sort of dusty and
shallow
and shallow, yes, and just not very interesting, whereas the monsters are always really interesting. But on the other hand, the monsters are smashing people up and killing them and doing terrible things, so I think, it's an interesting thing with a lot of the festivals that I went to, that there is this sense where we suspend our disbelief when we're seeing a performance of a monster. And so it's something that happened, for example, in Cornwall, when they put on the pageant of Bolster the Giant, and you have this story of Bolster the Giant, who's causing all kinds of trouble, and he's a terrible nuisance, but he's defeated rather cruelly, I think, by Saint Agnes, who he's in love with. And so she says, well, if you can bleed into this little hole in the cliff and fill it with your blood, then I'll come and live with you. But of course, she knows that those holes drill all the way through to the sea, and so all his blood drains out, and he eventually collapses dead. But when they put on the pageant every May Day in the village just outside the village of St Agnes in Cornwall, people sigh. And people are quite sad, and then they play the bagpipes to really sort of milk it.
Yeah.
And there's an atmosphere of melancholy, and of that something's not quite right about this. The giant has been tricked, and it's a bit mean. And I think often when you talk to children about monsters, children often don't mind, I think, the monster being sort of blown up or sort of destroyed in some big explosive way. But if the monster's been tricked or tormented in some way, or sort of mistreated, I think sometimes children get a bit upset about that, partly because, of course, the monster, the creature that sort of stomps and shouts and gets very, very cross very quickly, I think children can often empathize with that. So and I think we all can, really, which I think is why monsters do have that appeal to us, because we'd all quite like to be able to break the rules, and to just sort of say to hell with it all, and to stamp our feet, and then to smash a few things. And the monster is, we can sort of, I think, a lot of us can sort of recognize, if not ourselves, at least our sort of aspirations, or our, the sort of the unshackled version of ourselves that, we might like to experience once in a while. That's the whole point of Jekyll and Hyde, the idea, that you can turn yourself into the creature, at least for the night. It's the fantasy of the werewolf, I guess, the idea that maybe you could just do that for a little bit and just sort of really enjoy being completely unbridled, and wouldn't that be wonderful? So I think there's all that has that appeal to people, and has that we're probably able to be a bit more open about than I think, back in the past, certainly sort of before the 19th century, I think it's sort of in the 19th century that people started to sort of recognize that side of themselves and are increasingly sort of able to see. And I think you can see that in the sort of monster stories that are being told.
Yeah, I mean, that is, I guess, it's perfectly told in that brilliant bit of folklore, The Incredible Hulk. I guess that is the
Yes.
kind of the epitome of that, isn't it?
Well,
Turning
it's
into a
much
monster,
better, isn't
turning
it?
back into Bruce Banner and feeling really guilty about it. And I think
Yeah.
to write a villain well, you do need them to be a bit sympathetic. Otherwise, they're just shallow, aren't they?
Yes,
And then that in
exactly.
turn gives the hero, if they're a good hero worth their salt, a moral
Yeah.
quandary where they have to decide to help this monster or decide, no, you know what, even if he's sympathetic, I've got to slay it to save more people. But yeah, I think, Craig, you had one, didn't you?
No, I do. Yeah, I have another. It's more of a point than a question. I suppose there's a bit of a question wrapped up in it. So there's kind of a recurring theme when we've been looking at cryptids and monsters, particularly over this year, I think, where
Mm.
we've kind of noticed that they've taken on a bit of a role of like a nature spirit or guardian.
Mm,
Creatures like Bigfoot are kind of a prime example.
yeah.
Either through their origins in our own psyche or a representation of the wild places. So I wondered whether you think this is accurate, and if so, do any of the monsters you covered in Monsterland fit that bill?
Well, there's a lot of stories of dragons as protective spirits, especially in Chinese culture, and a lot of Asian stories about dragons sort of see them as more sort of bestowers of blessings, which I think has a lot to do with climate and our relationship with rain. But certainly, yes, I think the I'm always interested in where there's a sort of ambiguity about the monsters or the creatures. There's a chapter in the book about the Selkies who are not really monsters at all, but they are supernatural creatures who can be in some stories treated as monsters, and they can certainly be very destructive if they choose to be, especially when they're working together. And I think there's an element there in which they are the sort of a very early form of this idea of the sort of the supernatural creature that is a guardian. In this case, they're guardians to the fisher people, to people who fish, to children who are swimming and maybe get out of their depth. And there are many stories sort of going back through the ages of seals sort of coming to the help of people who are drowning or people who have lost their way at sea or are in a storm or something.
Not always so nice to cattle, though, right?
Yeah, not no. And they they certainly can be, they could. That's the thing about seals, that they have they have all kinds of angles to them. They can be quite vicious, but they can also, they have this sort of huge intelligence which is very apparent if you sort of observe them. So all these stories have sort of developed about them over the ages. So I think you definitely have that sense of a sort of watching spirit. One of the classic stories of the Selkies is of the Selkie woman who sheds her seal skin and dances on the shore, and then is her seal skin is stolen by this man the farmer who falls in love with her and wants to take her back to his croft, and then she has to go with him and brew his ale for him and bear his children for him, until eventually she gets hold of her seal skin again and is able to go back into her natural form and go back out to the sea. But she's always there sort of watching her children then, and sort of looking after them if they get out of their depth. I think I probably steered away from the sort of other guardian of nature sort of figures, partly because I think I was looking at quite a long span of history, and I think there is a tendency, perhaps in sort of recent sort of revisionist mythology, to sort of to see creatures as guardians of nature, which is, I think, is a very sort of fair and true reflection of a lot of the stories. They are there. I think, for example, you've got old Croker Crocken, I think, who on Dartmoor, who's been sort of kind of co-opted as a mascot for the Right to Roam movement, and that's reflecting something true in the folklore, of the story of the sort of the creature that lives out there on the moor, and that it reflects something of it's our kind of imaginative projection onto the landscape. So it's certainly a part of monsters that I think is there, and is a really interesting part of the monster story. You know, the idea that they are protecting the landscape. I think that's there actually right in the earliest monster stories. Really, if you look at the Humbaba the Terrible in Gilgamesh, it's the garden of the cedar forest which Gilgamesh sort of wants to chop down. So so the heroes, the humans, are really. I think there's definitely another way of seeing that story. They are, well, doing what humans have been doing ever since, really. Smashing up the land, and the monster is just trying to stop them. And so is he a monster? He becomes a monster in the story because he tries to stop them, and so they destroy him. So yeah.
I mean, that is the beauty of folklore, isn't it? It's a sort of a true. We were chatting to Eileen, who does the Scottish Folklore podcast recently, and we were talking about how like folklore and storytelling it's a reflection throughout history of the people's psyche at the time, and it adapts to that psyche and what they're thinking about, what they're worried about. And so, in a ways, that is quite a valid, even if it is more of a recent thing, it's quite it's reflecting the stories we're telling and how we're telling them, I guess. Just like Robin Hood was very different in the original tellings than later on, I guess. It's, but
yeah. Well, I think when you've got some of those stories that have been told and retold over different ages, then it's a really interesting and useful way of being able to see how attitudes have changed, or see sort of through the nuances in those different stories. You mentioned Robin Hood. If you look at sort of the original ballads of Robin Hood and compare them with, say, the latest TV or film versions, there's so much difference there, and that tells a lot about different attitudes of different times. And I think definitely with stories of monsters as well. If you go back to some of the medieval stories about dragons were seen as something really quite repellent and representative of the devil and evil, and they were ugly. Whereas now our dragons generally are magnificent.
stupendous, even.
They're depicted exactly. They're splendid. They're remarkable, and they're sort of aristocrats, the sort of aristocratic figures of the monster world. There's something very sort of wondrously they're sort of superior, aren't they? They're sort of the ultimate sort of superior monster as well.
Can we just acknowledge that Nick sounds like he's trying to persuade Smaug not to eat him?
Yes, I do sound like that. My speech. If I ever get trapped in a cave because
that's it.
I've accidentally kicked over the wrong goblet, and the dragon suddenly opens that huge golden eye, then I've already practiced my mercy.
Good thing to have. Good thing to have. And I mean, I think you might have caught my story in when I met you in Hartford. When I told Piers Shonks,
then, didn't you? Yes.
Yeah, and that was, again, it was one of those very much it was tied to the devil. The devil comes out and curses Piers because it's his favourite pet. But so just after reading the book, why you might not believe in monsters necessarily in the physical aspect, and you'll see where this is leading. Was there anywhere on your travels that you did feel like a crossing over that boundary and a bit of a sense of unease? I mean, you stayed in bothies and sheds and out in the wilds. Was there anywhere you were worried there might be more than just a story?
I think I was pushing it constantly through the journeys that I went on and challenging my own sort of skepticism. And I think also that I was aware that inside me I'm probably juggling sort of several different attitudes. And there is sort of broadly an attitude of sort of being sort of growing up in a sort of rationalist background and sort of thinking, no, there's no such thing as monsters. They're just sort of wonderful things that we imagine for stories. And then another part of me that where the hairs sort of prick up and that fear sort of crawls down the spine and it's all quite exciting, and you think, I think there's something out there, I don't quite know what it is. And yes, it is something that sort of pulsed through the journey at different moments of it. But probably where I felt it most intensely was when I went out to the Balkans and explored stories of vampires. And I think this is partly because vampires themselves are plausible in a way that some monsters are less so, in that it is you know, all you need is slightly sharp teeth, and you can look like a vampire. You know, there's, you know, it doesn't take much to put on to pretend to be a vampire. But I'd been exploring some of these sort of old stories from the 17th and 18th century when the vampire craze took over, and Voltaire, the French satirist, talked about how in the 1730s nothing was spoken about more than vampires, and it's sort of it's long before Bram Stoker. So it's a period when the word vampire really sort of took off in sort of common currency, and it was specifically in 1732 from a particular case that was reported in a Viennese newspaper and then translated into other languages across Europe, that the word vampire came out from the Serbo-Croat and moved across into Britain and France, and that was in Serbia, and that was where a lot of these cases emerged. Others emerged in Bosnia, in Croatia, you know, across that region, and it was being tussled at the time between the Austrian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And it's something I find fascinating about a lot of these sort of monster crazes that have happened throughout history is that they're often connected to some moment of political turmoil. So you have, for example, a werewolf craze that went on in France during the 1600s.
Beast of Gévaudan, you know, sort of off the back. The Beast of Gévaudan was sort of off the back of a bit of something like
exactly.
that, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I think that was a real spate of sort of people genuinely being afraid that werewolves really were about, and that they were, you know, that they were attacking the sheep and they were attacking children and so on. You know, there are stories of people being brought before the High Court judges in Bordeaux, you know, accused of being werewolves, and even in some cases admitting to being werewolves. There's a very disturbed case of a young man called Jean Grenier who was locked up in a monastery, and who did believe, in some sense, that was reported as believing that he had become a kind of a werewolf. So in France in the 1600s, a lot of those sort of werewolf stories emerging, and then in the Balkans in the 1700s, there's a lot of stories of vampires, and they were being, you know, tussled between these empires. I think there were also specific things to do with the fact that a lot of graves, there's a lot of people buried in sort of close to the home. So you're often quite close to the undead, and if you've had a fraught relationship with them, that can, you know, that can open up all kinds of cans of worms. So there are lots of different things going on, and so a lot of these stories evolving, and amongst them there's a place called Zaroje, which is associated with perhaps Serbia's most iconic vampire, who is called Sava Savanovic, wonderfully named vampire. And the story goes that Sava Savanovic was a miller who was a very bad man. He fell in love with this woman, and she didn't love him back, and so he shot her. And so the villagers all sort of converged on him and killed him, and then they buried him far away under a place called the Spreading Elm by the Crooked Ravine, and decided they were never going to talk about him again. They would forget about him because he was so bad, which turned out to be an error, because when it comes to vampires, you do actually want to remember their name. And so years later, decades later, the mill was haunted. People couldn't go to the mill. They couldn't grind their flour. They couldn't have any bread. They couldn't bake the bread because you know, they couldn't get into the mill. And so you know, they could have built another mill, but they didn't. So they'd gather in the tavern complaining, "We can't bake our bread. What can we do?" And a young man called Strahinja, this sort of plucky young lad who comes along in these stories, came along and he said, "Well, I'm in love with Radoika, who lives across the way, but her father Dushman is so aggressive, he'll never let me near her, but she loves me. She loves it when I play the flute and all that. So, you know, can you guys help me?" So they said, "Well, get rid of our vampire and we'll help you." So he goes along to the mill, and he doesn't know much about vampires, so he's taken a pistol with him, or a couple of pistols, but what he has cleverly done is, when he gets into the mill, he sorts out the catch tub and everything, he puts down a log and puts a cloth over it, and then so it looks like a sleeping figure, and then he hides up in the loft and he waits until night comes, the nightjar's churring, the bats squawking and squeaking, and the door of the mill creaking open, and the vampire comes into the mill, and he grabs hold of the log because he thinks it's a human being, and he bites it, but of course it's a log, which would cause quite a lot of damage to his teeth, except he's a vampire, and vampires have pretty strong teeth. But he screams out, "Sava Savanovic, tonight you have gone without your supper." And then Strahinja shoots him with his pistols, but the vampire disappears in a sort of puff of mist and goes and turns into a butterfly, which in Serbian folklore is the sort of the familiar, the soul of the vampire. In fact, not so much the bat; it's the butterfly in particular. And so then the next day, Strahinja goes over to the tavern and they say, "Oh, have you killed the vampire?" "No, I haven't, but I have found out the vampire's name. Now I just need to find out somebody who knows where he's buried." And they eventually find the oldest lady in the village, Mijana, who recognizes the name, says, "Oh, yes, I remember Sava Stefanovic. He was a terrible man. Yes, they buried him. Oh, where was it? Oh, under the crooked ravine, under the spreading elm tree." So they all go out to the spreading elm tree, the crooked ravine. They find the coffin. They open it up, and there is the vampire. And Strahinja can tell it's the vampire that he shot because he can see his hand, and the wound is already healing because of course wounds heal so fast on vampires. So they stake him with a hawthorn stake, which is the best sort of type of tree to use, and right in the heart, and out of the vampire's mouth as he's dying, the butterfly appears, and they all try to grab the butterfly, but of course they can't because it's very hard to actually grab a butterfly. And then to celebrate, they take the vampire's been defeated at last, and the villagers take Strahinja on their shoulders and carry him to the farm of his beloved Radoika and insist that they must be allowed to marry. And they have a big feast where at last they are able to bake some bread because at last the mill is back and open and working again. So that's the story that they tell out there in Zorozhe about this mill. And the mill is still standing. It's over a river called the anyway, the name of the river temporarily escapes me. But it's the mill is standing, and it's under these wonderful mountains, and you've got the basalt cliffs of the mountains, which are known as the vampire's teeth, and it's a wonderful sort of wood of oak and beech trees, and very atmospheric wood. But I thought, well, I'm very interested in this story, and I'd met a Serbian novelist who had used that story and kind of sort of retooled it in her own novel. A novelist called Mijana Novakovic in a book called Fear and Her Servant. So it's a story that's very much sort of current and alive. It goes back to the 18th century, back to that folklore, but has been retold. There's a film from the 1970s called The She Butterfly, or the title would translate as, which is a sort of iconic horror movie in Serbian culture, and is based on this story. So there's lots of resonances about it throughout Serbian folklore. So I thought, yes, I should definitely sort of investigate this story. But the problem was, where was I going to stay? And I couldn't find any Airbnbs in the area or any sort of budget hotels. I mean, I do travel on quite a budget. But then I realized there was somewhere to stay, and it was told to me in the story, because Strahinja stayed in the mill. So maybe I should do the same. But I thought this is going to be a test, really, of whether I do believe in vampires and, staying in a, I thought, well, once I thought about it, I thought I've got to do this. But it was a test. Do I, I thought I don't believe in vampires, but if I stay in a haunted mill that, is said to be haunted by this vampire for hundreds of years, I will find out whether I really don't believe. So I'll read a passage from the book about my favorite stay, my favorite sort of night stay of the journey, really. So, one by one, the features around me were snuffed out. The bridge, the rocks where I'd washed my feet, the river, and finally the mill. The only enduring sound was the churning of the water over the rocks, splashing and frothing between the fallen branches. Otherwise, the sounds were new. Or perhaps I hadn't been listening out for them. The rustling on the other bank, the scratching and shifting of leaves in the undergrowth. When I stepped on a scree of pebbles, there was a comical plopping in the water. Silence fanned around me like a nervous intake of breath. Then an explosion of scraping sounds under the trees. I backed up the slope above the river, and as the last of the light shrank between the trees, I pulled myself inside the mill. Please God, I wrote in my diary, let me pass through the night in peace. At 8:30, deadly dark by now, the valley filled with a blaring of engines. Through the crack of the door, I could see headlamps flashing on the bridge. Bikers? The floor of the mill was scattered with bottle caps and cigarette butts. I imagined night prowlers, Satanists, some Balkan version of the Lost Boys. I feared how they might react to a lone foreigner in their den. But on they rode, engines gunning, motors grinding up the hill. Relief poured out like a leaking of my veins. Nervous as I was of wild animals, of creatures crawling out of the dark, of the wolves and bears successfully reintroduced into the Poblin Mountains in recent years, there was nothing I feared so much as humans. Still, the sounds of nature were scraping at my nerves. What was that whining in the ceiling? A bat? Hardly a comforting thought when your mind's full of vampires. No, it was high-pitched, but too repetitive. I zoomed in on the sound, trying to make the cheeping tangible, to separate it from the spectres in my imagination. A sparrow chick, perhaps, trapped in the roof of the mill. Fatigue was making my body limp. I rested my back against the bedstone, shuddering when it banged at the wall. Sleep wasn't on the cards tonight. Who'd even want to sleep in a place like this? Better to sit it out and move off at the first glimmer of light. At last that moment came. It was 4:00 a.m., dawn a pale promise on the crest of the gorge. I'd lasted 8 hours of dark. Surely that counted for enough. I tiptoed out of the hut and climbed up to the bridge. The sky was as clear as a star chart. Orion was drawing his bow, and the plough looked as if it was ready to scoop up the pole star. Shooting stars dived through the sky, scratches of gold against velvety black. Looking up at that spectacle of light, I felt a swelling inside me. I bounded forward, throbbing with the joy of being alive, or at least not undead.
Fantastic, thank you. I admit I have heard you tell that one before, but I was glad when I asked you if you'd read something. I was quite glad it was that one. Interestingly, just as a quick note, Craig always. I mean, we haven't stayed many places. We stayed at Corfe Castle. We stayed at. We spent a fair amount of time in a barrow, and like Craig's always said.
Oh, what about Dartmoor? We stayed at
Dartmoor, of course. Yeah,
Jamaica Inn.
Yeah.
Jamaica Inn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, what in the inn?
Yes.
Yeah, we stayed in the inn. Yeah.
Wow.
Fun.
What was that like?
It was nice. I mean, it's just it's a hotel. I don't think anything. The only thing that was haunting was Craig's snores. You know, it's. I was probably worse than that, but we did just a quick one. We stayed on Dartmoor, and we just picked a tour literally because it was the one that was the flattest, shortest route to get to.
We just went, should we go to that one or that one? Let's go to that one. Didn't know what it was.
And it was getting dark as we arrived. And just out of interest, we decided to do the deep sort of research we do in these instances and Google where we were. And it was Vixen Tor, and it has a legend attached to it of a witch called Vixana or Vixiana in some versions. And essentially, this was a witch that had the gnomes of the earth, which I love that term. Again, band name. From a prog band, I reckon. Anyway, she had them raise up this Tor, and she lived in a cave in the Tor halfway up, and she would summon a mist that would make weary travellers get lost on the moor, and they'd drown by the foot of the Tor, and she'd go and eat them or something. And we only learnt this while camping just the other side of a little sort of wall to this Tor. And so we tell the story a little bit, record ourselves talking about it, having a cooking our pot noodles or whatever we're having. And just as we finished recording, I was like, that is a mist rolling in. And the next morning, you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you. Thankfully, we were fairly close to the road. If we were like another half mile out, I don't think we'd have found it properly.
We had to just go, the road's over there, we'll walk that way.
Yeah, our tent, this tent is facing the road, just walk straight, hopefully. But what was interesting, and you get this a lot anyway, I know, when you're camping, but I thought I heard Craig getting up in the night, and I assumed he was getting up to wind me up and was going to do a candid camera bit. He thought I'd gotten up in the night to go for a pee or something.
Oh.
Neither of us got out of our tents, but definitely felt like we heard something out there. But,
oh my god! Right, yeah.
But yeah, that was interesting, and I was excited we found a spot that had a bit of folklore behind it, but at the same time, I was also sort of thinking, oh, it is a little bit unnerving. And then I was kind of pleased there was this really thick mist, but at the same time, it was like, oh, okay, that is, you see where these myths sprang up from. But I was just going to say, it's interesting that you say something that Craig always says, which is, it's humans that are the scary ones,
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, but I don't know if I'd want to meet the gnomes of the earth on a dark night on Dartmoor.
I don't know. In my version of the story, I think, well, at least when I steal it for a D&D game or something, they're going to have been coerced into it.
You sort of feel like gnomes you might be able to negotiate with.
Yeah, Vixiana.
Bits off your tent or something.
She was defeated, though. Apparently, she lured the wrong chap who doesn't really go into his story much, but he was enchanted so he could see through mists. And he had a cloak that could hide him from evil vision. So he managed to essentially, in her rage, she flies out looking for him and she drowns in her own bog.
Pushed by her own petard. So there you go. Wow.
But that's fantastic. I mean, we do have a few questions that we kind of a bit more light-hearted that we tend to go over with the with guests. Um, do you have a personal favorite cryptid or creature from folklore? And you might have already answered this, but not just with your book, but anything at all that you find particularly compelling or intriguing.
Are you saying a cryptid specifically?
Cryptid or monster from folklore. It can be either or.
Actually, one of my favorite cryptids is probably the Yeti. I find a lot of the Tibetan sort of folklore around the Yeti really, really intriguing. So that's one of the monsters that I wasn't able to explore in this book, because I think that would be I think that journey would be quite a big journey in itself. But that's something that I'd love to sort of delve into at some point in the future.
I mean, that was the one. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, then you kind of change in the direction of the book a bit, right? Because you're going more into like a cryptid explorer rather than a
yes, exactly.
folklorist.
Cryptids weren't really the I think they're kind of a different subject, but I think the Yeti itself is sort of overlaps with lots of different things, because I think there's the cryptid element, which is actually probably the element that I'm less interested in, and there's the sort of folk monster or folk creature element that goes back over centuries of Tibetan and Nepalese and so on storytelling. And all kinds of stories of hermit monks out on the mountains, sort of encountering this creature that sometimes would bring them blessings or do good things to them in some way, and then sometimes would menace them. And I think there's there's stories of monasteries in the mountains where they have the skull of a yeti, or the finger bone of a yeti, and so on. All that kind of stuff. I mean, that then goes back into I think more of the cryptid side. But I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there with the stories of the yeti.
Well, I mean, was it Norio Suzuki, the chap who found one of the last Japanese holdouts in World War II, sort of in the 70s, wasn't it? I think he found Hiru Onoda, and he said that he wanted to see a panda, he wanted to find Hiru Onoda, and he wanted to see a yeti. And he actually died searching for the yeti. He got caught in an avalanche while looking for the yeti. So, the search claims lives.
It does. Well, exactly. There you go. There's one of its victims.
There you go.
Yeah.
So, kind of following up on that a bit, is there a creature, doesn't have to be from your Monsterland book, but a creature in general that you'd prefer to find out genuinely doesn't exist? One that you hope might exist? And then maybe is there one that you wouldn't mind having as like a pet or a companion?
I think I'm good with zombies not existing.
Yeah, solid choice.
I don't really I don't really like the idea of zombies in the world. I don't think it's good for anyone, really. I don't think anybody does well out of zombies. And there's zombies is definitely one monster you really don't want to be. So I think that's the first one. So the second one is any one that might exist.
One that you hope does exist.
I hope does exist. I think probably something like the Yeti. I love the idea that one of those cryptids, or Nessie. I was in Scotland recently, and in Nairnshire, which is quite close to Inverness. So I was asking, and I was doing various visits to schools, sort of talking about doing kind of monster workshops with some schools. I was asking a lot of the school kids, the sort of talking about lots of different monsters. Do any local monsters around here? Well, we got Nessie, of course. Yes. Oh, and does Nessie exist? And they had all sorts of theories. Some of them had some very convoluted theories. There was one about there being a tunnel under Loch Ness that Nessie's got trapped in for the last couple of 100 years, but it's going to break out eventually and be free. I think it would be pretty cool actually if Nessie did appear. It would be. Yeah, I think any of the. I think it would be quite cool if Bigfoot appeared as well. But yeah, I think Nessie. I think that would be great. Although I think given how over visited Loch Ness already is, I think it would. I'm not sure if they have the infrastructure to cope, or if anywhere could have the infrastructure actually to cope with the influx that would happen if Nessie actually did exist. So I would wish it, but with a caveat. And then the one that I'd have as a pet. Well, I mean, I'd like to have a pet dragon, but I don't want it to grow that much, I guess.
Just like a baby one. Just
Yeah, like could you get a baby one that sort of somehow didn't mature, just stayed in stasis, kind
Kind of like
of.
the Lambton worm before it got too big for the well. It's
Yeah. If you could sort of, but without that, stifling its. But then you're stifling its nature, aren't you? And that wouldn't be good. No, you've got to let it grow. It's got to
do you
grow
reckon?
and fly the roost and just go and burn things.
Do you reckon it's like goldfish, where like sort of they kind of grow to the size of their tank? It's
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, you could sort of constrain them, but the idea of a dragon being constrained is
yeah, I
not.
get that.
Yeah. So yeah, no, maybe not a dragon then. Um, maybe a. Oh, there's a creature in Near Eastern folklore, the Kalakanzari, which is a sort of mischievous, kind of impish, goblin-like creature. It has a sort of cloven feet and a bushy tail and sort of pointy ears, and they're a bit naughty and mischievous. They're not very evil, but they will cause you trouble. And I think at their worst, they will cause you a lot of trouble, and probably kill you. But they seem like the kind of creatures that you could probably live with. You could have them as a sort of living, if not in your house, at least you could have a kind of friendly relationship with them, and you'd have to keep appeasing them and making deals with them and keeping them happy. I think they've
Or
got
if they
but yeah, I wouldn't mind one of them maybe as a friend.
if they get out of line, just give them a colander, right? Is it colander? Something lots of holes in,
yeah,
or pennies, or something. It's counting. It's the counting. I remember
Yeah,
reading up
yeah.
on them, and they
yeah. Well, that's one of the things that a lot of these creatures, they have some really random weakness. It's like I mean, one of my favorites in that respect is the basilisk. I mean, maybe the basilisk would be a good one to have as well, except of course you can't look in its eyes. But the basilisk is ferocious. Has this sort of ferocious, venomous breath that scorches the earth, but it's vulnerable to the smell of a weasel.
I love that. I love that.
So specific.
Yeah, it's very specific, and that's according to Pliny the Elder. Back 2,000 years ago or so.
That's legit then.
So it's legit. Pliny,
Yeah.
Pliny wouldn't have made that up.
Exactly.
No.
Was it Pliny the Elder that died when Vesuvius went up?
Yes, what an amazing character. I mean, yes, an amazing death, which any sort of know-it-all should have.
Right.
I think
Conspiracy theory here. It
Yeah.
wasn't the vapors from that. It was the basilisk.
It may be the basilisk is what was inside Vesuvius. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what killed
Yeah.
him. So yeah, I was just going to put in real quick that I've chatted about this to Craig before, but I remember at the age of about 7 or 8 thinking, I hope they never find out if Nessie exists or not, because kind of it would keep the magic if we don't know. And surprisingly self-aware, or maybe prophetic of what I spend my evenings doing now, I guess. But yeah, it's just even at that age, I think I liked.
Yeah, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I agree. I think part of the power of these stories is that even if there's not very much evidence that these things do exist, or if it seems quite convincing that they're highly unlikely to exist, there's always that little sort of pocket of the imagination in the back of our heads that can go, yes.
Oh, maybe.
And they also, I think this is something I talk about in the book, that I think monsters are a sort of corrective to kind of scientific hubris, to our idea that we do know everything, that monsters reflect that recognition that there are things that are sort of beyond our ken, things beyond, everything known in heaven and earth, that there are these mysteries, and that's we're drawn to them. There's something, I think, in human nature that certainly in some human natures, that's pulled towards that sense that there might still be these mysteries out there. I mean, there's so much that we still don't know, and so kind of plug that gap for us.
Yeah, I mean, just to wrap up, having traveled the world for Monsterland, we kind of wonder what's next for you.
Yes. Well, I've just come back from a trip to the Scottish Highlands, and I did go on a bit of a wander whilst I was there, in search of a glen with a shieling, an old sort of sheep sort of shepherd's hut,
Yeah.
which is associated with stories of an ancient sort of goddess, sorceress sort of figure from myths, the Caig. You might come across in sort of some of the old sort of Celtic myths. So I'm looking at some of these sort of ancient stories around Britain and Ireland, really, and sort of looking at how I can sort of pull some of those together. Yes, Monsterland was very international, so here I'm looking a bit sort of closer to home, but still plenty of adventures to be undertaken along the way.
Look forward to it.
Probably a lot of great.
I mean, is there anything that you would like to plug? I mean, like where best place for people to get your book? Have you got a website, anything like that?
Yes, I have a website, www.nickjubber.com, and you can find me on Instagram, Nick Jubber, and the book is available in the usual outlets. And yeah, please do buy the book, and if you've enjoyed it, leave a review, which would be lovely.
I very much did enjoy it. I'm not saying that just because you're here. Yeah, I've not kind of read anything that's done in that style before. That mixture of the sort of travelogue and the folklore together, I really enjoyed that style. So,
cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, I do hear that you are at Waterstones in Bournemouth on the 29th of October. So I might pop along and say hello.
Great. Well, it'd be lovely to see you if you make it.
So I don't have an excuse. It's literally about 20 minutes away, so like walking. So yeah,
you've already heard me talking often enough, so you might.
It's all right. It's all right. I think it's your round. I think it's your round this time. Anyway, I'm joking.
It is. That's true.
Maybe I'm not.
Then yes, you might get.
Do you know what? I'm in Bournemouth 4 days before that.
It's annoying. So I looked up. I was like, "See, we're going to see this. It's the Uncanny live, and yeah, we're hoping.
That's the podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And yeah, well, I was thinking, if only that had lined up a little bit. Yeah, I love you, Craig, but you're not staying here for 4 days. Plus, you got to work. But Nick, thank you so much. Sorry, I know it's taken quite a while, but
that's no worries. These things do.
Do like chatting to you.
Yeah, it was fun. Thanks. Yeah, it's always nice chatting. So yeah.
Thanks for coming on. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Meet you, Craig, and yeah, we'll
hopefully see you end of October. And so that's about it from us today. Thank you very much for tuning in. Craig, hit him with the socials.
Yeah, you can find us at Wyrd Wessex on all social medias. We're at Wyrd_Wessex on Instagram, and our website is wyrdwessex.co.uk. You can find blog posts and the podcast.
And everything else weird and wonderful. So thank you for tuning in. Again, thank you once more to Nick for joining us. Hope you enjoyed the episode, and until next time,
stay weird.